Welcome to Deerhound Productions. I'm Daycare and today I'll be discussing the differences between the Mimic story in Tales from the Pizzaplex and Secret of the Mimic. Then at the end of this video, I'll rank each version of the story. While the story remains roughly the same across adaptations, the characters exhibit significant changes between continuities. So let's start off with those. I think the biggest issue people had with the game adaptation was with the character of Edwin Murray, the man who made the Mimic. In Tales from the Pizzaplex, this inventor was a self-made man who started his own company from the ground up. The Edwin we got in the games is, not that. In Secret of the Mimic, Edwin's father founded Murray Co. and their factory, Murray's Costume Manor. I have mixed feelings about this addition. While I think it diminishes Edwin's character and the significance of Murray Co. since he didn't build it from the ground up, I think it does put a lot more pressure on him. Throughout Secret of the Mimic, it's made pretty apparent that Edwin Murray is a workaholic, ignoring his wife and son so he can keep making new inventions.
This is the one. Bigger than the Cleanovac.
That's great, honey, but you're missing the party.
David's 2 years old. He won't remember a thing.
However, it seems like he does this because he's under a lot of pressure to keep his father's business running.
He's gone. He's gone, and now everyone is asking me what to do? And I don't know anything. I can't run a company. I'm not ready. I can't fill his shoes. He knew it. Everyone knew it. The company is going to collapse and they're all going to hate me.
I will say that while this makes sense character-wise, it feels incredibly unnecessary. Sure, keeping the family business going is a lot of pressure, but I feel like nothing would really change if Edwin established Murray Co. himself. In fact, you could argue it would make the company even more important to him. The whole plotline with Edwin's dad just feels unnecessary, and while it's not a big issue, it's not really something I care for in this adaptation. But anyways, Edwin works hard to keep MCM going, sadly at the cost of spending time with his family, whom he mostly just ignores. I agree with people who say this makes Edwin less empathetic, but I also think it makes him vastly more interesting. In the books, Edwin was just a man who was dealt a bad hand. Sure, it's tragic, but nothing very unique. In Secret of the Mimic, his company is still destroyed by factors outside of his control, like Fall Fest and Fazbear Entertainment, but he chose to neglect his family. Unlike in the books, where he had to work to provide for David, which sadly led to him being ignored. However, in Secret of the Mimic, I find it so much more interesting to see Edwin take his family for granted. I believe it makes their deaths much more impactful for him. We hear this in an audio log after David's death, where he has the realization that he's wasted his life working instead of being there for his son.
All this time wasted? I should have been having fun with him, playing games and teaching him how to make things. But I didn't.
Instead of Edwin just grieving his family, he's grieving the time that he missed. The time when he chose to ignore his son in favor of working. I think it makes his loss so much more upsetting. He's absolutely much less sympathetic. Sometimes he's outright mean to his family and his employees. But I think he's so much more interesting and less of a one-dimensional character. There are shades to him rather than just being a wholesome man with horrifically bad luck, which is something we've seen play out plenty of times in the series. Now we have a character who's pretty much caused this whole tragic downfall, and it's up to us to decide whether or not we should feel bad for him. However, something that hasn't changed about Edwin is his inventive nature. Even though MCM has a bunch of employees working there, the game makes it very clear that Edwin is still the brains behind all of Murray's technology. In the books, his first patent was a robotic vacuum cleaner, which funded a good life for Edwin and Fiona. This plot point was adapted to the games with the Cleanovac, which also appears to be a predecessor to the Pizzaplex's wet floor bots. Similar to the books, this seems to be Murray's most popular invention, judging from the billboard of it outside MCM, the golden statue of it in the lobby, and the various Cleanovacs scattered throughout the game. I think this is a great callback to the books. I'll discuss this a lot throughout the video, but there are so many neat references to Tales. Besides the story implications, which we'll focus on in a bit, the Cleanovacs are adorable. It's so cute that you can pet them. But anyways, as any good adaptation does, Edwin's inventions are expanded upon. And not just with the animatronics or carnival games. I'm talking about Edwin's retail inventions such as the previously mentioned Cleanovac, the Stay-Up Latte, Murray's Magic Coat Rack, and the Mycelium Men toys. Not only is it neat to see Edwin's inventions expanded upon, but I think they help contribute to the Mimic. It's implied that the titular endoskeleton is actually the culmination of Edwin's previous inventions. It learns like the Stay-Up Latte, copies voices like the Mycelium Men dolls, and shapeshifts like Murray's Magic Coat Rack and the Cleanovac. I think this is a great addition and really drives home the point that the Mimic is a symbol of Edwin's legacy. This is given even more meaning with the reveal that in the games, the Mimic was actually made to replicate David. The evil endoskeleton, also known as M2, is a copy of the original M1 program, which we'll cover later. This copy was created to mimic David's personality so the Murrays could all be together again. At first, this really threw me off, but I want to start by acknowledging that it's not too different from the Mimic's role in the books. In Tales from the Pizzaplex, the Mimic was already a copy of David, just more so indirectly. The animatronic curled his arm like David, he wore mascot costumes like him. Even his whole Storyteller and Tiger Rock persona were derived from David's obsession with his tiger doll. In both adaptations, the Mimic is even attacked for copying David. In Tales, he mimics David's made-up sign language, and in the games, he's beaten for copying his voice. Everything about the Mimic originated from David, so making him a replica of David in the games makes sense. I think it adds more significance to his behavior. After learning that the Mimic was made to copy David, his behavior throughout Ruin and Secret of the Mimic, such as taunting his prey and playing with them, it makes a lot more sense. Of course, he acts so childishly. He started out as a replica of David. The arm curl also gains a whole new meaning. Not only is it a copy of the Murray's son, but it's a tragic echo of who this monster used to be. The endoskeleton mimicking Gregory in Ruin also has another layer of significance, with it serving as a parallel to the animatronic's original persona of David. The scene of M2 being beaten by Edwin also calls back to Cassie telling the Mimic that he isn't Gregory.
Stop! You're not him. You're not!
You're not Gregory.
This might also explain why the Mimic yells that he's Gregory during his jump scare. Cassie reminded him of when he was attacked, making him even more rageful and defensive of his identity. I also think it's important to note that, unlike in the books, the Mimic never actually met David. However, in Moon.exe, it's implied that he still views him as a friend. In the minigame, we play as M2, and a baby owl follows us around, seemingly as a representation of David. When the baby owl dies, M2 is upset and vows to bring him back no matter the cost, so it seems like he wants another David. Bad jokes aside, while in this adaptation, the Mimic never met David, he still thinks of the boy as his friend. This is likely because he's a copy of M1, so he has her memories of David. Along with that, Moon.exe implies that M2 uses items from the Murrays to create memories of David. Personally, I'm kind of mixed on this. I love the Mimic and David being friends, but we still kind of get that with M1. Again, we'll focus on her later. Moving on from David, let's discuss the Mimic's main gameplay mechanic. The endoskeleton hides in costumes around Murray's costume manor, and then at random, he springs to life and hunts the player. Now what's really cool about this mechanic is that's exactly how the Mimic behaves in the Tales from the Pizzaplex books. In those, the Mimic would hide within costumes in Edwin's factory or Freddy Fazbear's pizza place, biding its time until it starts roaming around in search of new victims. I think it's really cool how well this behavior was translated to the game, and it helps make this adaptation really faithful. Something else that's adapted well is the Mimic's brutality. In the books, the animatronic has some incredibly violent kills, but sadly, you can't really adapt that into a game rated for teens. However, I think Secret of the Mimic still does a good job with this. There are dead bodies scattered throughout Murray's costume manor, but unlike in the books, the Mimic stuffs their bodies in costumes, which helps censor any gore that likely wouldn't slide past the teen rating, and it serves as a neat callback to the original games. Something else that's different is the Mimic's murder method. In the books, he killed people in various ways, but in Secret of the Mimic, it sounds like the animatronic tears off people's limbs and he stuffs them in costumes befitting their personality. Afterwards, he simply leaves them to bleed to death.
The previous technicians considered it an honor to lose limbs in the service of their company, and I'm sure they would tell you that themselves if they hadn't died from blood loss.
When he catches you, which one will he choose? Who are you deep down inside? Another worker bee? A bumbling bee? Perhaps a busy bee?
If you're a fan of Tales from the Pizzaplex, then you might have noticed that tearing off limbs is similar to how in that blogs, the Mimic tore off the heads and limbs of its victims. It's neat to see this adapted, but I think that being caught by the Mimic is even more terrifying in the games. In Tales, his kills were violent, but they were over fairly quickly. Instead in the games, he tears off your limbs before leaving you to die. It's less brutal, but sounds more painful and drawn out. Another way the Mimic's violence is adapted is through his interactions with his surroundings. When the endoskeleton adapts to other animatronics in scripted sequences, we get to see it be very violent and destructive, damaging the environment and other characters. We get the best look at this when he adapts to Jackie. Not only does he tear himself out of the music box, but when the digityper disturbs him, he knocks him aside before violently attacking the bot and throwing his body straight through a wall. So while the Mimic can't explicitly attack humans in a game, we still see his violence inflicted upon another robot, and the aftermath of its grisly murders. There's even a reference to a kill from Tales. One of the animatronic's poor victims was crammed into a refrigerator so violently that he had nearly been decapitated, and all of his limbs were snapped. In the game adaptation, you can see an open refrigerator with a blood trail leading away, implying that a similar kill occurred, and the body was moved to be stuffed in a costume. Specific reference aside, I think having the Mimic unleash its violence in its surroundings and hiding the bodies of its victims is a great compromise for adapting this brutal robot into a game series aimed at a wider audience. But something that had a more significant change is the origins of the Mimic's shapeshifting. While I loved his story and tales, I always thought it gave a poor explanation for where the Mimic's reconfiguring abilities came from. The animatronic was originally made out of scrap by Edwin as a new friend for David, but it couldn't reconfigure its body until it was captured by Fazbear Entertainment, which upgraded the original endoskeleton with the ability to adapt to any costume. And they even made more Mimic endoskeletons. This was neat, but also incredibly pointless. Prior to the Mimic being retrieved and upgraded by Fazbear, the endoskeleton had already dressed up in various mascot costumes, such as an alligator, a mycelium man, a jester, and a lion. So logically, the Mimic really should have had that ability already if he wore all those costumes. It also begs the question of why he needed these reconfiguring abilities if he could already wear multiple mascots. It just felt very messy and pointless. Also, nothing ever happens with those other Mimic endoskeletons, making this plotline even more unnecessary. In the games, however, it's revealed that the Mimic endoskeleton had always been designed to expand and retract, allowing it to fit in any costume so it could keep David entertained. I think this is a much more logical reason for the Mimic to have these abilities. Also, since it could always reconfigure, it avoids the unnecessary addition of Fazbear Entertainment adding those shape-shifting properties later on. Speaking of which, this game is a fantastic explanation for the Mimic's constant need to adapt to new costumes and characters. Granted, this one is more of a theory, but it's implied that since Edwin beat M2 for copying David, the animatronic no longer knows who or what it's supposed to be after it was attacked for its identity. This is a much more compelling and surprisingly tragic reason behind the Mimic constantly switching between different characters and personas. It adds more depth and tragedy to the animatronic's key trait. Also, speaking of Edwin, something that's so much better about this adaptation is that unlike the books, we get a proper interaction between Edwin and the Mimic after he attacked the bot. The closest we got to this was in a Tales from the Pizzaplex story named The Storyteller. In that entry, Fazbear Entertainment installed the Mimic's AI program into the Pizzaplex. It takes on the form of a metal white tiger called the Storyteller, and is housed within a giant metal tree. In the ending of that story, another character named Mr. Burrows finds Edwin dead inside the tree after trapping him there. Surrounding the dead old man are sheets of construction paper with the words, "I'm sorry," likely Edwin apologizing to the Mimic for beating it. Having Edwin die like this sucked, although him trying to make amends with the Mimic was pretty interesting. However, Secret of the Mimic adapts the scene and does it so much better. In the game's unfinished business ending, we get to hear a recording of the Mimic and Edwin. It turns out that after being attacked by Edwin, the animatronic went to his office and began repairing itself. But this resulted in an explosion which injured Edwin. He begs for the Mimic's help, but in a disturbing scene, the machine talks back to him in his own voice, giving him a taste of his own medicine by ignoring Edwin like he had neglected David, and presumably leaving him to die. This scene is much better than Edwin's death in The Storyteller, because we actually get to hear an interaction between the Mimic and his creator. It's also disturbingly satisfying to hear Edwin realize just how badly he's messed up. I also think it goes without saying, but the Mimic causing Edwin's death is much more satisfying than him being trapped in a metal tree by Fazbear Entertainment's board chairman. That being said, Edwin might still be alive, since in an update, a mysterious silhouette was added to the warehouse manager's office, and that might be Edwin, but I'm not quite sure. Regardless, I think the scene works much better. Another interesting thing is that we learned that the Mimic built new legs after Edwin attacked him. This is a neat nod to the Mimic's origin in Tales, where the endoskeleton was initially created without legs. Fazbear Entertainment's workers attached the endoskeleton to another pair of legs, and it thanked them by slaughtering them all. However, in the game, the Mimic was built with legs, but they were broken after Edwin unleashed his wrath upon his robot son. Instead of Fazbear fixing up the endoskeleton, the Mimic repaired itself. He also replaced his broken hand with one more pincher-like, possibly as a reference to his pincher hands in his Tales origin story. Anyways, I think this is a great way to clearly showcase the Mimic's ability to repair and upgrade itself, something that was hinted at in Ruin and Tales from the Pizzaplex's epilogues. This is yet another case of Secret of the Mimic expanding upon and clearly showcasing things that were briefly featured in the books and Ruin, which helps us get a much clearer understanding of the Mimic's character. Overall, I believe that all these additions or changes really make Secret of the Mimic feel like a much more polished version of the story from Tales from the Pizzaplex. Adding on to this is Fiona's expanded role. In Tales from the Pizzaplex, calling Fiona Murray a character is being generous. All she does is marry Edwin, then die during childbirth. She's somewhat haunted the narrative, but she felt like a plot device rather than a character whose death should invoke tragedy. Her memory torments Edwin, but there's not much to her. However, in Secret of the Mimic, she's more of a prevalent and sympathetic character, mostly because we actually get to know her before her demise, which was also changed. In the games, Fiona lived through childbirth, but burnt to death in a fire at one of the Fall Fest events, which finally explains the weird significance that Fall Fest has had throughout the games. Since Fiona lives longer, she gets a lot more characterization, which really goes a long way in making her death more tragic. And there are some interesting implications regarding how Edwin treats her in this game.
Mom, you won't have to leave the kitchen for the house to be spotless.
So yeah, there's definitely a bit to unpack with Edwin's views on a woman's role in the family. And I plan on covering that in a future video, as there's just too much to dive into here. Something great about this game is even after her death, Fiona is still a major part of the story, thanks to her robotic doppelganger, F10 and 4. One of the biggest changes between the books and the games is that the original Mimic, also known as M1, is a mimic of Fiona Murray. It's implied in the basement recording that M1 watched tapes of Fiona and began to copy her, either turning it into a mimic of Fiona or inspiring Edwin to reprogram M1 into a replica of her. It's also implied that, similar to Tales, David's love and joy played a role in M1's development.
Every copy has failed. I don't even know why it worked the first time. But it did.
This also adds a neat parallel between the two mimics, with M1 being created from David's love and M2 from Edwin's rage. Both of those emotions played a role in shaping the endoskeleton in Tales. It feels like Scott Cawthon essentially split the Mimic into two characters for this game. Regardless, M1 becomes F10 and 4, a robotic version of Edwin's deceased wife. This is honestly one of the most disturbing parts of the game for me, specifically when we see F10 and 4 on David's birthday. It's so revolting and deeply disturbing to see this machine acting like it's Fiona. It's an effective way to show how wrong Edwin is to try to remake his family with machines. F10 and 4 is a great way to have Fiona play a bigger role in the story, even if it is just a robot replica of her. Again, much like the actual Fiona, there's a lot to read into with how Edwin replaces his wife from the machine that doesn't even act like the original woman. Again, that'll have to be covered in another video, but what I will say is that I love F10 and 4 as a character. She's very interesting and a great way to keep Fiona present even beyond death. I'm also glad that this game explained the origins of the Mex's machine. It was a major mystery and ruin, and I appreciate how F10 and 4 served as an easy to understand backstory for the machine. In case you missed the whole explanation or didn't watch our awesome timeline video for some reason, F10 and 4 designed the blueprints for something she called a cradle, a giant computer named Mechanical X-Form Experimental Storage, also known as Mexes. F10 and 4's AI was stored inside the computer alongside the Cradle program, which was made to keep M2 safe and provide boundaries to protect others from it. We see this in action in Security Breach's Ruin DLC, where the Cradle's used to keep the Mimic contained, making sure it's hidden and protected.
The Mex's security program was designed to keep it hidden.
I appreciate how clearly Mexes was explained in Secret of the Mimic, and I think the implication that the entity was actually F10 and 4 makes Mexes a much more interesting character. Instead of just being a security program designed to lock the Mimic away forever, they're actually his robo-mom trying to protect him from the world and trying to protect the world from him. I find that much more interesting, although I might just be biased since F10 and 4 was one of my favorite parts of this adaptation. For more information about her and Mexes, I'd recommend checking out our timeline video. But moving on, similar to Fiona, David Murray has an expanded role beyond his death. He returns as a ghostly manifestation of his white tiger doll. This was actually foreshadowed in Tales from the Pizzaplex. The Mimic's origin story starts with David yelling, "Daddy, I'm a ghost," hinting at his role in Secret of the Mimic. In this game, he appears throughout the manor before trying to attack Arnold in the dark basement. I've seen a lot of people on Twitter refer to this as the scariest part of the game, and rightfully so. It's terrifying running around in the dark as the ghostly tiger teleports around you. David also seems to have another paranormal cameo in the Moon.exe minigame. This game is built from the memories of the Murrays and M2's life. It seems to focus on F10 and 4's goal of reprogramming the Mimic into David. When answering David's toy phone in the game, there's a child crying who says, "He never sees me." While there's room for interpretation here, I believe this is meant to be David's spirit crying because his father is unable to see him haunting MCM. I think it's an extra tragic touch to David's story. Even in death, his father ignores him. Even more tragic is it's revealed that he actually died on his 5th birthday. However, while I love David's ghostly role, I do have to admit that pretty much everything else about him in this adaptation is worse. First off, he's not really much of a character. While the first half of the Mimic's Tales story was almost entirely dedicated to David, there's only one audio log with him in the game. And while the birthday tapes have some nice scenes with him, those only occur at the end of the game, making him feel like a footnote rather than a key character in the story. That being said, I really enjoy the scenes with him that we do have. His birthday tapes tell a very tragic story, but he still feels like he's underutilized in the game despite being one of the most important characters in the Mimic story. His death is upsetting, but I feel like it would have been much more impactful if we followed his life throughout the events of the game, with more inclusions from him in audio logs and messages. So while I think his supernatural role in this game is phenomenal, I wish we got more scenes with him that lived up to his characterization from Tales. Another character who I think got a worse adaptation in this game is the Daycare Attendant. An overlooked aspect of Tales from the Pizzaplex is that it gave us the Daycare Attendant's backstory. In those books, the son was originally an old stage performer, whose gimmick was to turn evil when the lights went out. When he was later repurposed into the Daycare Attendant, the darkness trigger couldn't be removed, and the frequent blackouts created the moon side of the animatronic. This backstory even matched up with the games. In Ruin, we get a clear glimpse of the Daycare Attendant's teeth, which looks similar to another old animatronic, the Mimic. This, paired with the animatronic's lore and Tales, really made it feel like Secret of the Mimic would reveal that the Daycare Attendant was yet another MCM animatronic made for a stage show. And we kinda got that, but not quite. In the game, it was indeed revealed that the moon was created for a theater show at the manor, but rather than being the same animatronic from the Pizzaplex, it's a mascot costume named Sleepy Moon. I feel like this was a big missed opportunity to explore more of the Daycare Attendant's origins that were hinted at in Tales and reinforced in the games. Like most of the adaptations, it's similar but not quite the same thing. And don't get me wrong, I love Sleepy Moon. He's up there with Tiger as having one of the most terrifying gameplay segments. And the implications that he's a dead or crazed MCM employee wearing the costume are very cool. But at the same time, it feels like we could have just seen the Daycare Attendant's backstory. Granted, the game still shows us the origins of the Sun and Moon characters, and it implies that they're parallels for Edwin and Fiona / F10 and 4, which is pretty neat. But like I said, it's not the same Pizzaplex animatronic, which bothers me. Moving on from the characters, let's focus on the story surrounding the main gameplay. In the Mimic's original story, Edwin Murray ran away after beating the animatronic, and since he breached his contract with Fazbear Entertainment, the lace factory became their property. They sent their workers to repair the factory and finish Edwin's work, but of course, the Mimic murdered them all. Fazbear sent another team after this, and the origin story ends with them dying. Secret of the Mimic actually follows a pretty similar plot. After Edwin disappears, Fazbear sends their employees to MCM so they can retrieve the Mimic schematics and the endoskeleton itself. They also similarly own Edwin's land, with Fazbear gaining ownership as MCM collapsed. Speaking of which, Murray's costume manner is a major reason I prefer the game adaptation over the books. In Tales from the Pizzaplex, Edwin's business was housed in an abandoned lace factory that he purchased. He turned one of its small offices into an apartment for him and David to live in. A creepy abandoned lace factory is neat, and the living quarters are pretty unique. But I think Murray's costume manor is a much better location. I find it so awesome that we get to explore Costume Workshop. It's much more detailed than the factory from the books, and the seemingly endless hallways and rooms of costumes really adds to the paranoia of the Mimic's nearby presence. I clearly remember my first time entering the manor's storage. The various mascot costumes lurking in the dark made me feel very uneasy. MCM also has so many fun activities, like carnival games and various shows throughout the location. The welcome show, of course, being a highlight. This setting does a great job of balancing out warm and comforting visuals with dark areas and scenes, something that Security Breach didn't quite nail. Steel will also perfectly convey the 70s time period with Secret of the Mimic's environmental design. For example, the technology in the location is clearly older than what we've seen in any other game. It all has a retro-futuristic vibe that reminds me a lot of Fallout and the Loki series. The location's animatronics are also a great reflection of the time period. Steelwool's characters are usually shiny, flashy animatronics, fitting with the vibe of the Pizzaplex. However, Secret of the Mimic has a much older look for all of its characters. Most of the bots resemble real-life animatronics, with a more furry and costume-like appearance, rather than the FNAF style of animatronics with segmented limbs and visible endoskeletons. This is a fantastic way to reflect the differences of the time period and setting. It adds to the game's immersion, helping to sell that we're in an entirely different time period and focusing on a different company. It is an awesome and immersive location that completely blows the Krusty Lace factory out of the water. Another thing that's great about MCM is how it expands upon the past of Fazbear Entertainment. In Tales from the Pizzaplex, all we learned about Fazbear's origins were that they were already working on Freddy Fazbear's Pizza all the way back in the 70s. Secret of the Mimic, on the other hand, expands upon almost everything in the series. We learn about how Fazbear tore down MCM to build themselves up, poaching all of their employees and stealing their characters. I don't want to waste time diving into all the details and characters, so I'd recommend checking out our timeline video to learn more. But as a longtime fan of the series, I found this backstory very satisfying. Major characters like Chica, Foxy, Monty, and Roxy had their stories expanded, along with other characters like Music Man, Candy Cadet, and even the mediocre Melodies. There were also minor cameos from Fazbear's founders, Henry Emily and Willie Mafton. And even the backstory of Stan's budget tech was explained. Why not? I thought the story managed to satisfyingly tie the Mimic and Murrays to the origins of Fazbear Entertainment and the series as a whole, which is something that Tales just didn't do. Before this game, I even saw people on Twitter saying that the Mimic felt like something entirely unrelated from the rest of the FNAF story. But I believe that this game added a much more meaningful connection between the rest of the series and the Mimic. Another thing I want to discuss is the Murray's house. In Tales from the Pizzaplex, Edwin and Fiona purchased the old Queen Anne mansion and planned on restoring it. However, after Fiona's death, Edwin decided to sell it. And as we previously discussed, he and David lived in the factory. In Secret of the Mimic, instead of purchasing a mansion, Edwin's parents built their house. But much like the books, one of FNAF messages, and a foreclosure notice, implies that they're in danger of losing their home. However, in a message from Willie Mafton, he says that Fazbear now owns the land and won't touch the house. The biggest difference between these continuities is that Edwin's home actually plays a major role in some of the game's endings, which is foreshadowed by its presence on the game's menu. I think it's a fantastic decision to have the climax of a story so heavily focused on the Murrays taking place in their home. Aside from that, it also adds a nice variety of locations. Before we end this video, I do want to briefly discuss the Storyteller once again, since while this game is an adaptation of the Mimic story, it still features some elements from the Storyteller. First off is MCM's theater show, which uses a stage manager software to write and perform entire shows without a creative team. This is a pretty clear callback to how the Storyteller utilized the Mimic's program to write the Pizzaplex's story. It's yet another example of FNAF taking an anti-AI stance, which is always appreciated as more and more companies try to replace their talented employees with artificial intelligence. Speaking of the Metal Tiger, that Mimic form is actually referenced in the segment. The White Tiger ghost briefly appears as you're setting up the show, as a callback to its first appearance in the series. The White Tiger also plays a role in yet another callback, that being the storytime ending, which is very clearly based on the Storyteller. I mean, you have a White Tiger themed pedestal with the tiger doll on top, which you then use to tell a story. This is just a simple callback, so there's not as much to discuss, but I think it's neat how Scott and Steele reference other Mimic stories. And judging from a Storyteller reference in the upcoming Five Nights at Freddy's 2 film, we might be seeing more of that story. After all, the first movie teased this game with the date 1979 appearing on some props, a Springlock Bub suit similar to the one in this game, and an endoskeleton which Scott named Arnold, likely as a reference to Secret of the Mimic's protagonist.
What did Scott name the endo? Do you remember?
Arnold.
So judging from the Storyteller reference in the second film, maybe more elements of that story will be adapted in future games. But enough about that story, let's get down to my final ranking of each Mimic adaptation. I think Tales from the Pizzaplex gives us a clear understanding of David's character and a more sympathetic Edwin. However, I think the trade-off is better for a much more interesting take on Edwin as a workaholic. Sadly, we have much less David characterization in the game, and instead, he's a secondary antagonist, although I don't think that's worth losing out on his character. The Moon was also a minor antagonist, but similar to David, I think his backstory was more interesting in Tales. However, Fiona got a major upgrade, with much more characterization before her death, and a lingering presence with the existence of F10 and 4. On that note, I also prefer the Mimic's origins in the games. As I discussed, there's a lot more significance behind the creation of the endoskeleton and M2's actions throughout the rest of the series. Murray's costume manor is also a vastly superior location to the original story's Lace Factory. And the Murray's house was a great climactic setting for a story so heavily focusing on the family. Edwin's possible demise is also vastly superior to his lame death in the Storyteller, but who knows if he's dead for sure. And last, but certainly not least, Secret of the Mimic story makes the animatronic and the Murrays feel like they're part of the FNAF story, with their lives playing a major role in the backstory of the series rather than how Tales gave them very little impact. The manor serves as the origin for so many characters and companies in the series. It is a great way to connect the Mimic to the wider story. This adaptation does a great job of expanding upon the book series, going bigger for this game adaptation, and there are plenty of references and callbacks to satisfy hardcore fans of the books. Both adaptations are fantastic, but I think Secret of the Mimic takes the cake, mostly for Murray's costume manner and its depiction of the Murrays, even if David was kinda lame outside of his ghostly role. This is also the clearest showcase of the Mimic's personality. While I was a bit disappointed with Tales not being canon, I think this game makes up for that with its phenomenal story that expands upon and fleshes out the story that I love. This is pretty much everything I could have hoped for in a Mimic game, and I hope Scott and Seal keep going strong with whatever they have planned next. Until then, if you enjoyed this video, please consider liking, subscribing, and joining our monthly membership. It helps support us, and you get a bunch of cool perks like shoutouts in our videos, custom emojis, badges next to your name, exclusive looks at upcoming projects, and more. Special thanks to our current members Shaun and Toit, and thanks to you for watching. Be sure to check out some of our other videos.